Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we have another Pokemon TCG Pocket video, and today we're going to be taking a look at Mewtwo EX. Mewtwo might be the strongest basic Pokemon in the game, with 150 HP and 2 attacks that both deal 50 and 150 damage respectively. Now 4 energies for an attack cost is very expensive, which is why Mewtwo is often paired up with Gardevoir. Gardevoir is a stage 2 Pokemon with only 110 HP and an attack that only does 60 damage for 3 energies, but the reason we're playing Gardevoir is for its ability Psy Shadow. Once during your turn, you may take 1 psychic energy from your energy zone and attach it to the psychic Pokemon in your active spot. This card has some of the best energy acceleration in the entire game, and it is absolutely crucial for Mewtwo to be able to attack turn after turn for that massive 150 damage attack. This deck can also run some secondary attackers like the single prize Mewtwo and Jynx. But that's it for the intro. Let's go ahead and take a look at some deck lists. By the way guys, if you're watching this video, you're probably not subscribed to the channel, so if you're liking the videos and you want to stay tuned for more videos that I'll be uploading in the future, please go subscribe. I would really appreciate it. It means a lot to me and it's going to help the channel a lot. Alright, back to the video. Alright, first things first, let's take a look at the most popular version of Mewtwo EX. This is the deck that you're most likely going to see if you were to compete in online tournaments, and this is the deck that's doing the best in those online tournaments. And this is basically just sort of standard Mewtwo EX with 1 copy of the small basic basic Mewtwo, the single prize Mewtwo, right? With 120 HP and an attack that does 120 damage. It's virtually the exact same card as Mewtwo EX, except it's only a 1 prize Pokemon, but it has 120 HP and it does 120 damage, whereas Mewtwo EX is 150 HP and does 150 damage. But other than that, everything is very, very standard in this deck list. Now, the thing with Mewtwo that I oftentimes sort of think about with this deck is I put it sort of in the middle. If you think about, the 3 most popular decks in Pokemon TCG Pocket being, Pikachu, Mewtwo, and Charizard, and you look at them sort of as a spectrum, Charizard's going to be sort of all the way on the left, where it takes the longest to set up that deck, but it has the highest payoff, of course, doing 200 damage, able to one-shot any Pokemon in the game, whereas Pikachu doesn't really require any setup at all. It's all basic Pokemon, and there's low energy attack costs there. It does the least amount of damage, but it's the fastest paced deck. Mewtwo is somewhere in the middle of those two. It is a deck that does require some setup, but it is a deck that relies on basic Pokemon. So again, I think Mewtwo's right in the middle between Pikachu and Charizard, and in the last video, we talked a lot about Pikachu EX. Now, my opinion is that Pikachu was the most consistent deck in the format, but Mewtwo certainly seems to be the most powerful deck in the format. But most Mewtwo decks are all going to look very, very similar. We're going to cover, I think, 3 different deck lists in this video, but they're all going to be very similar. Like I said, they're going to be running 2 Ralts, 2 Kirlia, and 2 Gardevoir. This is, again, like the bread and butter of the deck. You're going to need to set up these Gardevoirs so that you can get that extra energy attachment to your Mewtwo in the active spot every turn, so that way we can just basically attack with Psy Drive for 150 damage turn after turn. Psy Drive is really strong, 4 energies, 150 damage. However, you discard 2 psychic energy from Mewtwo every time you use the attack. Now, you can manually attach 1 energy every turn, but because if we have a Gardevoir on our bench, we can basically attach 2 energies to this Mewtwo and attack for 150 damage every turn. Very, very powerful, especially on a basic Pokemon that you can put into play immediately and start attaching to. So that's kind of basically what this deck does. It's like Charizard in that sense. However, it's a little bit faster paced and a little bit easier to get set up. This deck in particular is running 1 copy of that small Mewtwo, and this card is actually really good in a couple of matchups. One specifically that I think it's really good in is the Pikachu matchup. I think that's sort of the main reason why you would play this Mewtwo card. It does have a retreat cost of 2. In fact, basically every card in this deck, Gardevoir and both Mewtwo's have a retreat cost of 2, but we are running 2x speed in the deck. The thing with the small Mewtwo is that it does 120 damage for 4 energies, and it has 120 HP, like I said, so you're not getting one-shotted by anything in the Pikachu deck other than like a Zapdos if it flips 3 or 4 heads on its 3 energy attack, but anything Mewtwo-wise, or Zebstrika, or Electrode, anything like that, you're not getting one-shotted, which is really nice, specifically the Pikachu, right? Because you're able to one-shot it back. So a lot of times you kind of use Mewtwo as kind of like a buffer, right? You just sort of have it in the active spot sometimes to buy yourself a turn or two to set up, a first or second Mewtwo if it comes down to it. But it's a very good attacking option as well because, like I said, that attack can one-shot a Mewtwo EX, and with a Giovanni, I think it can one-shot a Zapdos EX as well. So it's a very good card in the Pikachu matchup. It's another basic attacker in the deck. Adds a little bit of consistency to the deck because, of course, you only have 2 Mewtwo, so you want maybe an additional option to put on your bench. a lot of times it is actually pretty nice to get 2 Gardevoirs down on your bench, but if a Mewtwo goes down, then you have a bench spot open for the rest of the game, so that's kind of where that other Mewtwo comes into play. This deck in particular is running 2 Pokeballs and 2 Professor's Research. Of course, you always should be doing that. And we're running 2 X-Speed and 2 Potion. I think that Potion is definitely worthwhile in this deck, having 150 HP. Other sort of small decks with chip damage involved, Potion can really kind of help with that. Mewtwo has 150 HP. That's actually kind of a lot, if we're being honest with you. In terms of basic EX Pokemon, it's actually the most in the entire game. So Potion does seem to be very good in the deck. And this list is running 1 Sabrina, 1 Giovanni, and 1 red card. This is kind of a little bit of a spread here. Giovanni is interesting. I think it does help mainly on the smaller Mewtwo. For the 120, you can get up to 130. That's going to help with Zapdos and other EX Pokemon. I think like Articuno maybe that have 130 HP, or Moltres. I forget exactly how many EX Pokemon have 130 HP, but it's also can be good, I guess, against Executor. I think is the only card. Maybe Wigglytuff. How much HP does Wigglytuff have? I forget. But Executor does have 160 HP. So the 1 Giovanni, it's a little bit niche, but it does, kind of come into play sometimes, especially if, your opponent is using Potion. And then 1 Sabrina. Sabrina's just a great card. You can run 1 or 2 copies of Sabrina in any deck in the game. I think it makes a lot of sense. And then here we also see 1 red card. Red card is good in the mirror matchup. Any decks that do sort of need stage 2 Pokemon to set up, like Charizard or Mewtwo EX, or maybe like a Greninja deck, something like that, or Venusaur, even Blastoise, which you're never going to see, but yeah, Blastoise. So decks like that sort of require 2 evolutions to get their Pokemon set up. Red card is actually quite good because a lot of times they're going to be drawing for a couple turns, but they may already have the stage 2 Pokemon in hand. Your opponent may already have the Gardevoir in hand, and they have a Ralts in play, and they're sort of just waiting to have that Kirlia. So having that red card to play sort of mid to late game is actually really nice and can be the difference when it comes to winning the mirror matchup. So I do like red card quite a bit. All right, next up, let's take a look at a Mewtwo deck that is running Jynx as a secondary attacker. Jynx is a very interesting Pokemon. It only has 80 HP, but it is a basic Pokemon with a retreat cost of 1, and it has a 2 energy attack Psychic that does 30 damage and 20 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. Now, this card can actually do quite a bit of damage for only 2 energies, and you also have to keep in mind that with Gardevoir on your bench, this is really a single turn energy attachment attack. You can manually attach one and then use Gardevoir to attach one if Jynx is in the active spot. So in 1 turn, you can set up this card and it can get some KOs. The interesting thing with Jynx, though, is that I don't believe it's a better secondary attacking option as Mewtwo, and I'll tell you why. Let's just do an example here and take a look at what some of the math kind of adds up to in Pokemon that you might be attacking. So let's take a look at the Pikachu matchup. Now, Pikachu has 120 HP, and it has an attack that really only takes 2 energies, right, to use Pikachu's attack. So Psychic is going to do 30 plus 40, and that's 70 damage for 2 energy against Pikachu. That is a 2-hit KO, but in general, it's just very, very niche. That math isn't super relevant in any particular scenario. Zapdos is 130 HP, Zapdos EX, and it has a 3 energy attack cost. So if you are attacking a Zapdos with 3 energies, that's 30 plus 60, and that's doing 90 damage to a Zapdos. So again, we're not really one-hit KOing anything there. And then in the mirror matchup, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mewtwo runs 4 energies, right? So 4 plus 20 is 80, plus 30 is 110. That's a lot of damage, right? Well, not really, because if a Mewtwo is attacking, that means that it's discarding 2 psychic energies from its Mewtwo, right? So on your turn, the Mewtwo is only going to have 2 energies attached to it. So in the mirror matchup, it's interesting. Like, Jynx is only going to be attacking Mewtwo for 70 damage, like ever, maybe 90, but never against the Mewtwo that has 4 energies attached. So it's not a card that's really going to take any big one-hit KOs, and it's probably not going to be KOing any Gardevoirs or Kirlias or Raltses if you were to use Sabrina or anything like that, because they're likely not going to have energy attached to it. So in theory, Jynx is a pretty good attacker, right? Most Pokemon are going to have 2 or 3 energies attached to it, which means most of the time you're going to be doing 70 to 90 damage for 2 energies on a basic Pokemon, and that is quite strong. If we're being 100% honest with you, it's a strong attack. If Gardevoir set up, it's a consistent attacker. I just don't really feel like the math really works out in general, and in Mewtwo decks, you're not really taking any sort of cleanup KOs, right? If you're attacking with Mewtwo most of the time for that 150 damage, you're just going to be getting a KO. Now, if you don't get the KO with Mewtwo, you do also have Gardevoir on your bench anyway, which isn't a great attacker, but it does 60 damage. So, 150 plus 60 is enough to two-hit KO any Pokemon in the game. So Jynx is a weird one to me. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense as to why we would be running Jynx over really any other card in this deck. So this is an example of a deck with Jynx, but it's not a card that I would choose to play personally in Mewtwo EX. Okay, and lastly, we're going to take a look at a Mewtwo deck that is not running any secondary attackers, and this is actually perhaps my favorite way to play Mewtwo. You got to think about it like this, right? Basic Pokemon are extremely important in Pokemon TCG Pocket. You're guaranteed to start with one basic Pokemon at the beginning of the game, at least one, right? Because there's no mulligans in Pokemon TCG Pocket. So in a deck like this, you have a 50-50 chance of starting with a Ralts or a Mewtwo in hand, at least as the one guaranteed basic Pokemon that you're going to get. So let's say that you start with a Mewtwo or you start with a Ralts, right? That means you have either one Mewtwo or one Ralts left in your deck. We're running 2 Pokeballs, right? So when you play Pokeball, it's a coin toss, right? You don't know exactly what basic Pokemon you're going to pull out of your deck. It is entirely random. If you're running a secondary attacker in a scenario where you have a Ralts or you have a Mewtwo, but you don't have the other card, right, where you still need a Mewtwo EX, where you still need a Ralts, you play that Pokeball, you might not get either of them. And if you don't get a Ralts down turn 1, or if you don't get a Mewtwo down turn 1, that could be something that puts you a turn behind, and overall is going to make your deck less consistent. So a deck list like this is all about consistency, and that's why we're running no basic Pokemon other than the Ralts and the Mewtwo EX. Now, the one thing you'll notice about this deck is in place of a secondary attacker like the Mewtwo, we're running a Helix Fossil. And big shout out to Andrew Mahone and Tricky Jim for sort of covering this in a previous video, because I do think that this is actually a really interesting tech in Mewtwo. The thing with fossils in Pokemon TCG Pocket is they act like basic Pokemon in the sense that, you can play them onto your bench, and if they get KO'd, your opponent takes a point. They only have 40 HP, but here's the thing with the Helix Fossil is that you can't pull it out with Pokeball, right? So if you play Pokeball, you're either going to get the Ralts or you're going to get your Mewtwo EX. You're never going to pull that Helix Fossil because until it's in play, it's not considered a basic Pokemon. The other thing about this card is that you can actually choose to discard it at any time for no cost. Your opponent doesn't take any prizes, so you can put it on your bench basically as a way to guarantee that if your opponent plays Sabrina early in the game or mid-game, you can pull up a Helix Fossil into your active spot, and yes, they'll KO it and they'll take a prize card, but at least they're not KOing, a Ralts or a Curly or a Gardevoir on your bench, which again, it can be the difference between you winning or losing the game. So it's basically a way to protect yourself from Sabrina while also not sort of making your deck less consistent through the basic Pokemon search of Pokeball, right? That's kind of the basic gist of the Helix Fossil, but it's really, really interesting. Now, what matchups would you like to run the Helix Fossil in? It depends. It definitely depends. I think in the Mewtwo matchup, if you're in the mirror matchup, I think Helix Fossil can be really good. If your opponent, again, gets set up before you and they use Sabrina and they're targeting your Ralts, like you're in a really tough situation. All right, lastly, let's take a look at a Mewtwo deck that is not running any secondary attackers. In fact, we are focusing entirely on the main core strategy of these Mewtwo EX decks. Now, instead of running a secondary attacker like Jynx or the single prize Mewtwo, we're running actually a Helix Fossil. Now, you can run any fossil in this deck. They're all the same, but the thing with the fossils, right, is that they count as basic Pokemon when they're in play, but when they're in your deck, they do not count as basic Pokemon. And what this means basically is that a deck like Mewtwo EX is very reliant on Pokeball. You might start with a Mewtwo EX in your hand, you might start with a Ralts in your hand, and you might start with a Pokeball. Either way, you're going to want to get a Ralts and a Mewtwo down as soon as possible, especially Ralts, because if you don't get a Ralts down on your bench, or in the active spot at least, on your first turn, you're not going to be able to evolve into Curlia and then Gardevoir on turn 2 and turn 3, which means you're basically a turn behind, and in the mirror matchup, this can be extremely important. So when you're using Pokeball, you want to make sure that you're finding a Mewtwo EX or a Ralts off that Pokeball, and if you're running any secondary attackers like Jynx or the single prize Mewtwo, you can pull those with Pokeball, right? If you play Pokeball, you might get one of those cards and not necessarily the Ralts or the Mewtwo EX that you need. And this deck, or this version of the deck, is making it so that that is the most consistent version possible, where when you play Pokeball, you're never going to draw Helix Fossil because while it's in your deck, it doesn't count as a basic Pokemon, it counts as an item card. It doesn't count as a Pokemon until you play it down onto your bench. Now, Helix Fossil does only have 40 HP, so it is going to get KO'd very easily. However, you can actually discard fossils from play at any point of time during your turn. So if you do draw another Pokemon that you would rather play onto your bench, you can discard Helix Fossil for no cost and no prize cards for your opponent. And then, yeah, you can just sort of play whatever other Pokemon you want on your bench. the main reason why you would play Helix Fossil is to give you sort of your opponent a target with Sabrina early or mid game that isn't going to sort of KO any of your Ralts or your Curlia or your your Mewtwo's that are otherwise very important to your overall strategy to win the game. Now, your opponent does take a prize card when they KO your Fossil, and it's easy to do so, right, because they have 40 HP, but it's better than them KOing your Ralts or your Curlia on your bench, and then you just have absolutely no chance of winning the game after that, right? So it's a way to kind of give you another basic Pokemon backup option on your deck to add a little bit of consistency there to protect you from Sabrina, whereas it's not going to take up a slot chance for you to draw it with Pokeball later in the game. But yeah, that's sort of the idea with the Helix Fossil, or any of the fossils. Like I said, they're all the same, but it's a very interesting strategy. In this card, these fossils, they actually work pretty well in most decks as well. There's a lot of scenarios where these fossils can be very good, but this is just one example of them being used. Now, you can swap out a lot of cards in this deck. Like I said earlier, we have one Sabrina, one red card, one Giovanni. You can run really any configurations of those as you would like, whether that's 2 Giovanni, 2 red card, or 2 Sabrina. They're all good in various different matchups. Like I said, I think red card is good. Red card is good in the Charizard matchup as well as the Mirror matchup, which is actually maybe kind of important because Charizard, while it's not a very heavily played deck, it is actually a tough matchup for Mewtwo. And Sabrina is just good in all matchups. And Giovanni, I think, I'm not exactly sure, but there probably are scenarios where Giovanni's going to come up as well. So it really depends on which cards you would like to play and which cards you like to run in your deck. In terms of course, the Pokeball and the Research, you got to play 2 of those. And 2 Potion, 2 X Speed, I like to run 2 Potion and 2 X Speed in basically every deck in the game because there's just more scenarios, I think, where they're useful than the other cards that you might be running in place of them. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. This has been my Mewtwo EX Pokemon TCG Pocket guide, deck list video, or whatever you would like to call it. But hopefully you guys learned something. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. I really enjoy making these videos, and we've had a lot of views and a lot of support, a lot of likes, and a lot of subscribers over the last week or two since I've been making these Pokemon TCG Pocket videos. So I really do appreciate it. It means a lot to me, guys. If you're watching this, please subscribe. Please like the video. Please stay tuned for more Pokemon TCG Pocket videos that we will be uploading in the future. All right, guys, have a good one.